So let's talk about that phase two we've heard a fair amount about. There's a difference between phase two and phase one, which is you're going to need some Democrats to come along with you, as I understand it. And yet I haven't heard any reports that you're actually working with the Democrats. What's the deal?
Well, so it's very early. And so here's what we're trying to do. I'm talking with President Trump about this as well. We want to change the culture in Washington where we only fix this tax code once every 30 years. The truth is our competitors, Asia, Europe, others, are continually improving their tax code. And frankly, every business in America wakes up every day trying to figure out how are we improving our company, being more productive, being more competitive. We got to have that same approach on our tax code every year, looking for ways to make it better, more competitive, better for our Main Street businesses and families. So phase two is really about changing that culture and looking at things we can do better, including making some of the provisions that are long-term permanent, trying to make sure people can save more and earlier for retirement, looking at ways to really generate more innovation in America, because the country that wins that race, frankly, around the world wins the future. And so we're going to continue to work with anyone who's interested in continuing to make our tax code even better.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as you say, it's early going. We've got a midterm coming up in November, so it raises the question, do you plan to have phase two as a matter of law, get it done with the Democrats whom you need by November, or is this more a matter of something that you can use, as it were, in the off-year election to get victory?
Well, we welcome Democrats to work on continuing to help our families and our businesses grow. We now have one of the most competitive tax codes in the world, but we think we can do even more. We welcome their engagement in this, but look, they've got to make that decision. If they want to go back to the old tax code with higher tax rates and businesses and headquarters still moving overseas, rather than the new one where we're seeing the reverse, that investment in those jobs coming back home, that'll be their decision. But I know this, for Republicans and President Trump, we're going to spend every day looking at how we can make families stronger, businesses stronger, and America stronger.
So will that mean that you want this done by November, or changing the culture, does that also mean that it can be delayed until next year or the year after?
And so the timetable hasn't been set, but my thinking is that we move these phase two, continue to improve this year. We'll see if Democrats want to obstruct or want to be part of this process. I hope they are, but I think it's important we continue this just continuous improvement, that every business every day does the same thing.
Let's talk a little bit about the content of what that could involve. We're hearing that you could try to make permanent the individual tax cuts. What about the business expensing? Would you also consider extending that?
You know, the answer is yes. We think that's one of the most pro-growth parts of this tax code. Again, many of these provisions were long-term but not permanent because of the Senate budget rules. So I think moving to create that certainty is very important. But we also ought to be looking at other ways we can continue to make it more pro-growth. And there were some very good ideas that I heard from lawmakers coming from their communities that we're not in the tax reform proposal because we had a very deliberate timetable. And so I think we ought to bring those ideas out, make sure America can take a look at that and see if that's something they want in a pro-growth tax code.
Mr. Chairman, before we get to actually implementing phase two, we have to implement phase one. And I want to ask about what you think about that. As you know, you've followed closely how the IRS works, and there's a bipartisan bill pending right now to try to reform some of the IRS. We're told that the OMB may play a much larger role in really interpreting the statute that you've already gotten through Congress, taking some of the power perhaps away from the Treasury. Are you in favor of that?
And so there's sort of two issues there, David. One is what role does OMB play in the Treasury regulations that typically, traditionally clarify tax provisions, as you would expect, like in the President Reagan's reform, where several years were taken in those clarifications. You would expect this year, especially, a lot of those effort being made. I really think that role lies with Treasury. They know this tax code. They know the history of these provisions, and they work closely with us on instituting a new pro-growth tax code. I think that's where that ought to come from. But to your original point, yeah, we think a new tax code deserves a new IRS. And so we are working with Democrats on redesigning that agency so it is much more focused on taxpayer service, accuracy and protecting our taxpayer information in a major way. We look to see this moving in April. And so we'll continue to work that direction.
So, Mr. Chairman, you got that tax bill passed in December without a whole lot of support from the American people if you look at public opinion polls. That's improved somewhat, but still most polls say that less than half of Americans really are in favor of that. Is that going to be a benefit to you as a Republican running in November and your fellow Republicans, or are you going to have to run against it?
Yeah, well, that's not the polls I see. The majority of Americans now support tax reform for a simple reason. They were misled. They were told that all Americans would see a tax increase. This would do nothing for economic growth. They've seen just the opposite. 90% of workers have already seen bigger paychecks. The other 10% don't pay taxes, don't have that liability. So Americans are seeing real paychecks and growth because of the tax cuts. Secondly, they're also seeing dollars flow back to America, bonuses, bigger salaries, a better savings plan, and maternity benefits because of tax reform. And that's just in the first 4 months. And so I expect to see that support for this new tax reform. And more importantly, just to close this out, look, I don't see anyone coming up to me in Texas and saying, hey, let's go to the back to the bad old days. Let's keep seeing our jobs move overseas. Let's have Washington take more of what we earn, and let's watch small businesses struggle. I just don't see very many Texans or Americans saying, let's go back to the bad old tax code.
Are there any lawmakers coming to you talking about the growing deficit here in the U.S., the debt? Because eventually, whether it's phase 1 or phase 2, it will add to the growing U.S. debt. And if you want to make individual tax cuts permanent, that would mean a tax foundation analysis showing that it could cost $1.5 trillion in the decade after 2025. So if it's not only for political reasons, how would you justify that?
Well, let me ask you this. So when President Obama added $2 trillion to the deficit in 1 year, where were these people? 5 times when President Obama raised the deficit by more than $1 trillion in a year for government spending, where were these critics? We are making a small investment, $1 trillion over a decade, to get this economy jump-started, to bring those jobs back to America, and get Main Street growing again. This is a very modest and reasonable investment. And I think at the end of the day, over this decade, economic growth will cover the cost of tax reform. So I think this is a good, smart investment to break that old 2% growth every economist was predicting for America.
What about the fact that the international environment seems to have shifted a little bit? I was talking to the China ambassador to Washington just last week, and when I asked him about curtailing purchases of U.S. treasuries, he said all options are on the table. Are you concerned about debt financing going forward, especially when you have the Trump administration pushing for tariffs?
I think that's an empty threat by China. The truth of the matter is, with their shaky financial and banking system, they rely on the purchases of reliable U.S. treasuries in order to stabilize that system. I think, in truth, having these discussions between the president and China's leadership about lowering this trade deficit and about China ending its practice of stealing our U.S. technology and intellectual property. Frankly, it's long overdue. The challenge, as you know, is to make sure, and every president's faced this, is you have to be very cautious about punishing American families and workers for China's misbehavior. And so I think the president's right to be having these discussions with China. I think he's right to be listening carefully to American businesses and workers who are using fairly traded products. We have to make sure that tariffs don't stunt the growth in any way that's coming from the president's own tax cuts.
So finally, Mr. Chairman, discussions are one thing you just referred to. Trade war is something else. You talked about the Texans that you're talking with down there. They really like the tax cuts. How do they feel about a possible trade war? Is there any concern down there, as we hear from other, frankly, Republican states who are concerned about exports?
So I think it's important. Look, back home here, what I hear is that we want to be able to compete and win around the world. You hear that in energy, you hear it in manufacturing, you hear it in aerospace and technology. They're now armed with one of the most pro-growth tax codes in the world. They want to make sure that these markets are open, for them to sell around the world. I think that's important. We certainly in Congress have made the point to the president, look, you're right to target unfairly traded products. Leave fairly traded products alone. That's why we fought so hard and successfully for the exemption process for countries, the exclusion process for products, and now with the China tariffs, we're pushing hard to make sure that that these tariffs don't in some way impair our economy here at home.